Every town in America had a man who did one thing. He did it his whole life. He was known by it, and in a good many cases his name and his trade were the same word to everybody who lived there. Then, somewhere between the Depression and the Space Age, he stopped existing. Not gradually in most cases, within about a decade. I have spent years reading what those towns left behind on paper. Directories, licenses, advertisements in the back of local papers, the entries in census columns where a man wrote down what he was. And the trades in those columns are, a great many of them, jobs that no living American has ever held. 12 of them today. Every one of these was ordinary. Every one of these was in your town or your father's town, and most of them were gone before anybody thought to write about them. The last one on this list disappeared faster than any trade in American history, and the men who did it saw it coming years in advance. Let us begin. A word first about why these went, because it is nearly always the same reason, and it is not the one people expect. It was almost never that the work stopped being needed. The ice was still wanted. The knives still went dull. The shoes still wore through. What changed is that the work moved. Into a factory, into a machine, into a household appliance, or into a shop 200 miles away, that could do it for 1/10 of the price. The trade did not become useless. It became something a person bought instead of somebody they knew. And when that happened, it happened quickly. A trade that had existed in every American town for a century could empty out in 15 years. And the men who held it were generally in their 50s when it did. Number 12. The Iceman. Before the household refrigerator, every home that wanted to keep food cold had an icebox. And an icebox needs ice. And the ice had to be brought. So it was, several times a week, by a man with a wagon and later a truck, carrying blocks up staircases with tongs over his shoulder. Households put a card in the window showing how many pounds they wanted that day, turned to the right number, and he read it from the street. He knew every kitchen in the neighborhood because he walked into all of them. He knew who was ill, who had moved, who was behind on paying. The electric refrigerator ended it, and it ended it fast. In 1930, a small minority of American homes had one. Within about 20 years, it was most of them, and the Iceman had no route left. There was no version of the job that survived. The entire trade simply had nowhere to go. Number 11. The Milkman. He lasted considerably longer, and a great many Americans alive today remember the bottles on the step. The job was daily, and it was early, starting around 2 or 3 in the morning, and it ran on a level of trust that is hard to picture now. He let himself into porches. He knew standing orders without being told. Money was left out for him. Empty bottles were washed and returned, which is a deposit system a modern company would call innovative. What killed it was not refrigeration exactly. It was the supermarket and the family car. Once a household could buy a week of milk in one trip, paying a premium for daily delivery stopped making sense. It faded through the 60s and 70s rather than collapsing. But the shape of the loss was the same. A man who came to your house every day for years became an aisle. Number 10. The knife and scissors grinder. He came through the streets with a cart, and later a bicycle or a small truck rigged with a treadle-driven wheel, and he called out or rang a bell, and households brought out their knives, scissors, shears, and tools. He sharpened them on the spot, in the street, for a few cents each, and moved on. In cities, he had a fixed route and came around every few weeks. In rural areas, he might appear twice a year. He went for the plainest reason on this list. Blades got cheap. Once a knife cost less than a professional sharpening, the trade had no floor under it. It was not replaced by a better version of itself. It was replaced by throwing the knife away. I find him the most quietly significant man on this list, because his disappearance marks the exact point where America stopped maintaining things and started replacing them. Number 9. The cobbler. Not a shoe shop, a cobbler who repaired. Shoes in this period were built to be resold, which meant stitched or nailed construction that could be taken apart and rebuilt. A good pair might be resold 5 or 6 times over 15 years, and the cobbler was the man who did it, in a small shop that smelled of leather and wax. Every town had one. Larger towns had several, and they were busy. Cemented construction ended it. Once the sole was glued to the upper, rather than stitched, the shoe could not be sensibly rebuilt, and once shoes were cheap enough, it was not worth the labor anyway. There are still cobblers. There are perhaps a few thousand in a country that once had tens of thousands, and their work has shifted almost entirely to the expensive end of the market. Number 8. The elevator operator. Early elevators required a person. The controls were manual. The stopping was judged by eye and by feel, and leveling the car with the floor was a genuine skill that took practice to do smoothly. So every building of any size employed men, and often women, who spent their working lives in a box, going up and down, and who knew every tenant in the building and every visitor who came through. Automatic elevators existed from the 20s, but the public would not use them. People were frankly frightened of a machine with nobody in charge of it. What changed things was a strike in New York in the mid-40s that paralyzed the city, after which building owners had considerable enthusiasm for automation, and manufacturers ran advertising campaigns specifically to reassure the public. Within about 15 years, the job was essentially gone. Number 7. The switchboard operator. To make a call, you picked up and spoke to a person, and that person physically connected your line to another with a cord. In small towns, she knew everybody. She knew who was at whose house, who was away, and where the doctor could be found, because he had told her on his way out. In an emergency, people called her rather than any particular number. It was, for decades, one of the largest categories of employment for young women in America. Direct dialing ate it in stages from the 20s onward, and finished the job by the 60s. What is worth noting is what went with it. The switchboard operator was, in practice, a town's information system. Nothing replaced that function. The calls got connected, and the knowledge went away. Number 6. The typesetter. Every newspaper, every book, every printed handbill was assembled out of individual pieces of metal type, by hand for centuries, and then by machine on a keyboard that cast lines of type in molten lead. The men who ran those machines were skilled, unionized, and well paid, and the trade had a culture, an apprenticeship, and a language of its own. Photo composition and then computers destroyed it inside about 20 years. The newspaper strikes of the 70s were, in large part, about precisely this. What makes it striking is the level of the trade. This was not casual labor. This was a craft with a long apprenticeship and real status, and it vanished about as completely as any occupation in modern American history. Number 5. The tinsmith. Sheet metal, cut and folded and soldered into whatever a household or a farm needed. Buckets, funnels, pipes, gutters, roofing, cooking vessels, lamps, and repairs to any of the above. Every town had one, and on the frontier he was one of the first tradesmen to arrive, because nothing else in the settlement worked without containers. Mass production ended the making side of it. A stamped bucket from a factory cost a fraction of a made one. The repair side lasted a little longer, and then went the same way as the knife grinders, and for the same reason. Some of the trade survives inside modern sheet metal and ductwork, but the man on the main street who could make you a thing out of flat metal while you waited is gone. Number 4. The ragman. He came through with a cart, buying rags, bones, scrap metal, paper, and old clothing for very small sums, and sold them on. Rags in particular had real value, because paper was made from them. Bones went for glue and fertilizer. Metal went back to the foundry. He was, in plain terms, the recycling system, running as a private business with no organization behind it in every American city. Households sorted their waste because the ragman would pay for it. Municipal collection and changes in manufacturing took the economics out from under him by the middle of the century. The interesting part is that we have spent the last 50 years building, at considerable public expense, a worse version of what he was already doing for profit. Number 3. The lamplighter. Gas street lighting had to be lit every evening, one lamp at a time, by a man with a pole walking a route, and extinguished in the morning the same way. It was regular, it was reliable, and in most cities he was the last person on the streets at night and the first one out in the morning. In a good many neighborhoods, he was also, informally, the person who noticed things. A door open that should not be. A person out who should not be. Electric lighting and then automatic timers removed the need entirely. There was nothing to transition into. The job was walking and lighting, and once the lamps lit themselves, there was no residue of it left. Number 2. The town blacksmith. Not a farrier only, though he shod horses. The blacksmith made and repaired the iron of the entire town. Tools, hinges, wagon parts, farm implements, chains, gates, and anything that broke. He was, functionally, the town's spare parts department. If a thing was iron and it snapped, it went to him, and he made it work again, usually the same day. 2 things ended him at once. Mass-produced parts made replacement cheaper than repair, and the motor vehicle removed the horses. Between about 1920 and 1950, the trade emptied out almost completely. Blacksmithing exists now as an art. It existed then as infrastructure. And the difference between those 2 things is the whole story of this list. Number 1. The telegraph operator. And here is the one I mentioned at the start, because these men watched it coming. For a century, the telegraph was how America moved information at speed, and the operator was the man who did it, sending and receiving in Morse by ear and by hand. It was a genuine skill, and a fast operator was respected the way a fast typist never quite was. Every railroad station had one, every newspaper, every town of any size, and they knew better than anybody what the telephone meant, because they could see the wires going up, and they understood exactly what was traveling on them. There are accounts of operators discussing their own obsolescence decades before it arrived. It took a long time coming, and then it went all at once. The last commercial telegram services in the United States shut down in the 2000s, largely unnoticed, which is a peculiar ending for a technology that once carried the news of everything. 12 trades, then, and every one of them was a person somebody knew by name. I am not going to tell you it was better. Most of these jobs were hard, several were dangerous, and almost none of them paid well enough to be sentimental about. But there is something worth noticing in the pattern. Nearly every trade on this list was a person who came to you, or who you walked to, and who knew your household. What replaced them was cheaper, faster, and better in most measurable ways. It simply was not anybody. That is what keeps turning up in the directories, not nostalgia. just a very long list of people a town used to have. I am Harlan Fenwick. The Almanac continues.